I think that there's also, going back to what I was saying about the kind of misogynistic culture that we grow up with in this country. It's also an intensely homophobic culture, and I think that English is a subject that is very feminized in Australia, and Austen is the most feminized element of that. And so anyone working on Austen or anyone working on English really is kind of suspiciously, literary studies and masculinity do not go together in Australia. English classes that I've taught, overwhelmingly more women enrolled than men. The first openly queer people I ever encountered were in the English department at my university. And it was the first, not only that, but it was the first place where I had anyone speak openly about queer issues or queer culture ever. And so I think that it's, and at that time, that was, we're talking about the very early 2000s, and that was probably not true of any other part of the university, except maybe gender studies, which had just come out of the English department. So not the kind of thing that was being talked about at law schools, not the kind of thing that was being talked about in the history department. Like it just was not on anybody else's radar, but we had some fantastic scholars who were also queer in the department, and not closeted to the, and that was, I think they'd be very annoyed with me and very embarrassed to realise how much of an impact that had on students of my generation, but it did. It was hugely transformative. And so I think that there's a big part of Australian culture that would associate being interested in things like Jane Austen, particularly if men are interested in things like Jane Austen, as that being, I'm trying to think of a non-pejorative way to put this, but as that being a sign of sissiness, to use a term from my community. So I think that there's that aspect to it. But from me, reading Austen as a queer person, I see, and as very awkwardly, as a married queer person, I see her as being really, really skeptical about heteronormative relationships and heterosexual relationships. I see her as being, if I tend to think of the novel, one of the major ideological goals of the novel as being to help or persuade women to accept what historians call the Great Disinheritance, this kind of huge loss of political and social and economic power that begins in the 17th century and kind of hits its worst points around 1800. And I see Austen's novels as really undercutting that ideological goal of the novel and making that romance that is part of the novel. I don't mean capital R romance, I mean like lowercase hearts and flowers romance that's part of the novel. Really, really calling that into question, in a way that's very queer, right? And this kind of, that, and I, as a mother, but I do, taking my little girl out, there would be comments about, if she started playing with one of the little boys at the park, that there'd be comments about them being her boyfriend, or, comments that would kind of suggest, putting her in a very gendered kind of box. And if I made a joke that, we're raising her lesbian, people would be kind of shocked or try to argue with me that you can't, that's not a thing you can do. You can't it's like, well, we've all been theoretically raised heterosexual, and it didn't take, obviously, with some of us. But I think that's something where, reading Austen, you don't get a sense that every little girl is going to grow up to fall in love with every little boy, that it's not going to be happily ever after for everybody, and that all of these things are really, messy, as you would say, or contingent, or unwise even, or not ideal. And I think that that's something that I see as particularly kind of a queer way of looking at the world, of looking at the world and saying, well, everybody's supposed to do this, everybody's supposed to want these things, and why? I don't see that. I don't understand that. That doesn't seem natural to me, but it's supposed to be natural, and everybody keeps telling me that it's natural. But there's a disconnect there. And I think that disconnect allows Austen and allows other people to, and it's very easy for queer people to say, well, that's not always the case. That's not the case for everybody. It doesn't have to be the case for everybody. Everyone's kind of shunted into this narrative, and it's not the only potential narrative.